I found myself unexpectedly witnessing my husband's affair, an experience I believe to be quite rare. Most people discover infidelity through incriminating messages on their smartphones, but in my case, I saw it happen before my eyes. And what's even more surprising is the location where it unfolded, witnessed by numerous people. I'm Sarah, a full-time homemaker, and we have a 10-year-old son. On the day when I stumbled upon this affair, my husband had a day off, and we had plans for a family outing. However, when I woke up that morning, I realized that my husband was already gone. There was a message on my smartphone from him, explaining that my sister had a slight fever of 36 degrees Celsius, so he decided to take care of her since no one else was at home. He assured me he'd be back in the evening. I couldn't help but sigh deeply. I had promised our son a trip to the amusement park that day, and he had eagerly looked forward to it since the previous day. My husband had been swamped with a major project at work for the past 6 months, hardly ever taking a break. So this day off was a precious opportunity for some family quality time. However, he chose to attend to his sick sister. Now you might wonder what the problem is. After all, he's helping his ailing sister, right? Well, here's the catch. My husband has what some might call a sister complex. He used to tell me, "You're wonderful because you're just like my sister." And this used to give me an uneasy feeling. His sister is a remarkably beautiful and kind person, and I suppose resembling her is the highest form of compliment from my husband. However, it always made me a bit uncomfortable, despite the infuriation it would bring. However, the real issue is his tendency to disappear every morning, even on his days off, like today. On his days off, couldn't he at least spend some quality time with our child, who is undeniably a daddy's boy and often cries for his attention? When my husband is absent, he shows a striking indifference towards our child. He doesn't even bother to prepare birthday presents or participate in school events, regardless of how much free time he has. Sometimes, even when he returns home early, he simply retreats to his room, immersing himself in video games. He hardly ever engages with our son, who was once a daddy's boy. If this pattern continues, our son may eventually start seeing his father as a stranger. Speaking of my husband being busy due to a major project, that was a blatant falsehood. In reality, he hardly ever spends time at home. Once, I questioned a former classmate who works at the same company as my husband about his workload. To my surprise, my classmate burst into laughter and revealed that my husband is, in fact, a window-side employee, always appearing free because he has minimal work responsibilities. He consistently leaves work on time and never looks fatigued from overtime. Even though he claimed to be overseeing a significant project, his salary remains in the 200,000 yen range. Despite harboring numerous dissatisfactions, I went ahead and prepared breakfast. However, something felt amiss. Typically, my husband wakes up by 7 o'clock, even if I don't rouse him. But today, the clock had already passed that time, and he risked missing our child's bus to nursery school. In a rush, I ventured into my son's room to wake him. To my concern, he was still sound asleep. As I attempted to rouse him with a gentle nudge, instead of a response, I heard him groan in pain. Panicked, I reached out to touch my son's feverish face. His forehead was burning hot, and when I called his name and lightly shook his shoulder, he weakly murmured, "Mom, it hurts." I was on the verge of panic. Around this time, there had been an outbreak of an illness at the daycare center, and I feared my son might have fallen ill as well. I had heard of cases where people didn't survive this ailment, so I genuinely worried that my son might not pull through. I decided to reach out to my mother for some expert advice on first aid. She had a nursing background, so I believed her guidance would be invaluable. Follow. My son drank plenty of fluids while we waited. According to my mother, there was a risk of heat stroke. Considering the potential for infection, I couldn't accompany him in the ambulance. I quickly called a taxi and headed to the hospital where he would be taken. All the while, I continued trying to contact my husband, even though deep down, I knew it was futile. In desperation, I left a message online, hoping he would notice and come to our aid if he still felt any sense of responsibility. Upon arriving at the hospital, I anxiously waited in the corridor outside the emergency room, silently praying for my son's recovery. Memories of my father, who had once been taken into the emergency room and never came out, haunted my thoughts. I couldn't help but imagine the worst-case scenario. What if my son didn't make it either? My mother, who had rushed to the hospital, provided some much-needed comfort, assuring me that everything would be all right. An hour later, my son miraculously pulled through, though the doctors recommended he remain hospitalized for at least a week. Consequently, he was taken to a ward. To my disappointment, my husband didn't return home that day. The following day, I decided to visit my son in the hospital, bringing along a change of clothes and some fruit for him to enjoy. I also intended to express my gratitude to the doctor who had looked after us the previous day. As I walked past the emergency room, the atmosphere suddenly became chaotic. In my desperation, I tried calling my husband, but he didn't answer any of my calls or respond to my emails. There was simply no time to wait for a reply. I considered postponing my visit to the doctor, thinking that perhaps someone had been brought in, and I didn't want to get in the way. Just as I was about to head to my son's ward, I spotted a man and a woman being carried on a stretcher, barely covered by a blanket, almost as if they were naked. It seemed like they were still somehow connected, perhaps in one of those situations where certain physical aspects wouldn't disengage after an intimate encounter. Although I had never experienced it myself, I imagined it must be quite troublesome. Being transported in such a state must be incredibly embarrassing. As I pondered this and prepared to walk past, I inadvertently made eye contact with the man. In usual circumstances, it would have been an awkward situation, but for me, it was different. I was stunned because the man turned out to be my husband. "Why are you here like this?" I exclaimed in surprise. He seemed at a loss for words. I was equally confused. My son had just been admitted yesterday, and now my husband was in a similar predicament. What were the odds of that happening? Furthermore, why was my husband being transported in such a vulnerable state, and who was the woman with him? My mind was filled with a whirlwind of questions. Amidst all the confusion, I accidentally made eye contact with the woman who was intertwined with my husband. Even in my state of perplexity, I could tell that this woman was my husband's mistress. As I glared at her, I suddenly realized that her face was very familiar. "What? Here?" I heard her voice, and it finally clicked. Yes, that woman was Amelia, my husband's sister. In that moment, time seemed to stretch out infinitely. I began to suspect that my husband was lying about taking care of his sister and meeting another woman, but I never anticipated this. Even if he was coming to visit our son, he should not have arrived in such an intimate situation. However, the woman turned out to be his actual sister. There had to be limits to how much one could mess around. They were taken away on a stretcher, and all I could do was restrain my urge to confront them and wait. After all, there was no way for them to escape. I decided to address this later. With that thought in mind, I headed to visit my son, still feeling uneasy deep down. I spent some time in his room, trying to sort out my feelings. When I casually checked my phone, I noticed a multitude of messages from my husband online. Upon examining the content, it was clear that he was attempting to cover up his actions, not even mentioning our son's hospitalization. I chose to continue ignoring him and waited for another hour. Then, the doctor who had been in charge of my son the day before appeared. The doctor smiled at me and said, "Your son is doing remarkably well. He might be able to be discharged earlier than expected. His fever has subsided, and his condition seems to have completely stabilized. Initially, I was concerned about an infectious disease, but it appears he had a heat stroke in addition to the cold. You made sure he drank plenty of water, didn't you? That was the right move. You're a smart mother, and your son must be happy." He even praised me. If anything, it was thanks to my mother's advice. I deeply thanked the kind doctor and expressed my gratitude. However, beneath the surface, I knew I was about to face quite a storm. I had just been relieved about my son's condition, but inside, I was beginning to boil with anger. My face might have appeared calm, but I had inadvertently frightened my son. I quickly put on a smile and assured my son that I would be right back before stepping outside the hospital and calling my husband, who had left more than 100 unanswered calls. The moment my husband answered the phone, he began with a flurry of excuses, saying, "It's not what you think. There's a reason." It was evident that he had the order of priorities all wrong. Shouldn't he have been worried about our son first? There was no way a man who was so engrossed in his activities with his own sister, completely disregarding our son, would be genuinely concerned about him. I couldn't help but wonder if this was the kind of husband he had become. Concerned about my son's future and recognizing that my husband's character was unlikely to improve, I made the difficult decision to divorce him. I believed that life might become challenging, but I was willing to endure it for the sake of my son. I confronted my husband, saying, "You were busy with that even when our son was suffering, weren't you? You've always made time for it whenever you could, and with your own sister, it's truly disgusting." My husband was left speechless, and I continued, "Oh, and by the way, I've already informed your parents about this. I won't involve your company. It might be problematic if you can't meet alimony and child support payments. So, goodbye." Expressing my finality, I told my husband that I had already signed the divorce papers. 3 days later, my son's health improved more rapidly than expected. After completing the discharge procedures, we returned home together for the first time in a long while. Naturally, my husband wasn't there. After a period of commotion, my husband showed up to apologize in person. However, I presented him with the already signed divorce papers. He begged, saying, "It was my first time. Forgive me for this one mistake. You're all I have." I coldly responded, "So you're still lying. At this point, I already know everything. Your sister confessed to everything." I anticipated that my husband wouldn't easily agree to a divorce, so I decided to approach his sister, the person directly involved. "Sister-in-law," I began, "I heard you're going to have a wedding ceremony with your—" Her eyes widened, and she replied, "No way. You're not planning to talk about this, are you?" I smiled and said, "Yes, because I want everyone to understand what kind of person you are right away. If I disclose this, it will be crystal clear to everyone." She looked concerned and pleaded, "Please, anything but that. If you do that, my life will be ruined." Pretending to consider her request, I smiled and said, I guess we can't help it then. Here's an alternative. I'll keep quiet about this matter if you provide me with all the details of your involvement with my husband." I made a promise to my sister-in-law, ensuring that I would keep her secret. She confessed everything without hesitation, pleading with me not to reveal her actions to her younger brother. When I finally confronted my husband with this revelation, he was so shocked and betrayed that he fainted. He woke up, signed the divorce papers, and left the house in dejection. From that point on, I enlisted the help of my lawyer to pursue a divorce, custody of our son, Albany, and child support from my husband. He haggled over the amount, but when I whispered in his ear that I could expose the truth to his company, he relented and agreed to pay the amount I had requested. He left the lawyer's office with a heavy heart. Somehow, news of what happened at his company got out, and my husband was summoned and severely reprimanded. A month later, he was fired from his job and began working at a food factory, where he packed strawberries and cakes to meet his alimony and child support obligations. Even there, the knowledge of his actions seemed to follow him, with young girls constantly gossiping about him, making him uncomfortable. As for my husband's sister, although I hadn't exposed her directly, the truth came out, and she was dumped by her fiancé. It turned out that her boyfriend, like me, suspected infidelity and had hired a private investigator to conduct surveillance. She was demanded a significant sum of money as compensation for breaking off the engagement, and now she appears to be working at a nightclub. One day, her ex-boyfriend gave me a photo of them together, saying, "Use it if something happens." I wondered what possessed him to give such a thing to a woman like me, but I decided to keep it in my dresser, just in case. I moved back to my parents' home to start anew, and am working hard to raise my son with their support. My parents had longed to see their grandson since they lived far away, and they are assisting me as much as they can. I don't want to overburden them, so I only ask for their help when necessary. By the way, my son, who once suffered from a high fever, has been healthy ever since. 3 years later, he is consistently recognized for perfect attendance at school. He seems to have completely forgotten about his biological father and is enjoying his life to the fullest every day. This is what brings me the greatest happiness. Oh, and I have a new addition to the family, a white cat named Snow. Snow used to frequent my yard before I moved, and when I said my final goodbye, it climbed onto my lap and refused to leave. So, I decided to bring Snow home with me. Now, Snow has become an important part of my family, just as cherished as my son. I look forward to watching my son grow alongside my parents and Snow. As I stroked Snow on the porch, I reflected on these thoughts.